Oh, hi kids. In this episode, we're going to break down two terms that people say Paul uses to condemn homosexuality. Now, they're both vulgar slang terms, potentially for sexual behavior, so we're going to have to discuss some raunchy stuff, and the language is going to get salty. Now, I can bleep some of the language, but if you were hoping pegging wouldn't come up in a discussion of the Bible, consider this fair warning. In the last two episodes, we've looked at two biblical passages from the Hebrew Bible that Jewish and Christian homophobes bring up to justify their homophobia, and the choices they have to make to get what they want, passages that condemn homosexuality. But what about Christian New Testaments? Do any of those 27 texts say anything about homosexuality? Well, there are a couple verses in letters ascribed to the Apostle Paul, but it sort of depends on which translation you pick. In his first letter to the church in Corinth, Paul gives a vice list that denounces fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, and robbers, in the New Revised Standard Version. But see those two in the middle? Let's check out the New American Standard Bible. Here the male prostitutes become effeminate men, and the sodomites are expanded to homosexuals. The New International Version lumps the two together as men who have sex with men, while the French Seconde has transvestites and homosexuals. Notice the rest of the vices are basically the same, yet the two in the middle are sort of all over the place. If Bible translations can't agree, it's either because the translators don't like what the text says, or they don't really know. In this case, it's probably that they don't know. But in order to understand why translators struggle with this passage, and whether it has anything to do with homosexuality, let's ask a few critical questions in this episode of Sounds Like BS, Paul's Softies and Man-f***ers. A big problem is Paul doesn't list these vices often. One appears only here in the New Testament. One of them's a euphemism, the other one's a neologism, and both of them are slang. The thing about slang terms is you can't often translate them literally. Like, if someone calls you a motherfucker, they're probably not commenting on your Oedipal complex. Hopefully. So which two slang terms are we looking at? The first term is malakoi, which literally just means soft ones. In Greco-Roman anthropology, or their understanding of humanity, men were hot, hard, dry penetrators, while women were cold, moist, soft, and penetrable. So calling men soft would seem to say they're effeminate, but effeminate in what way? Roman effeminate may not be our effeminate. Well, one solution is to ask what kind of men are called soft. Aristotle says men are soft when they are unrestrained with regard to bodily pleasures, acting on desires without self-control. Those desires are not necessarily sexual. Someone who overeats acts on intense desires for food and may become physically soft as a result. And when the desires are sexual, a man who can't control himself with women, a straight man, is just as unrestrained, just as soft as anyone else. Closer to the time of the New Testament, Dio Chrysostom claims soft is an insult thrown at educated or well-dressed men. Surprisingly little has changed today.
What on earth could have made him think that I was interested in him? All I did was ask him if he was attached, and then we talked about the theater and men's fashions. Oh my God.
The Palestinian Jewish historian Josephus says that when the fort at Masada was about to be taken, a proposal was made for whole families to commit mass suicide to avoid capture by the Roman army. He says some men were eager to die a noble death, but others, the softer ones, were hesitant because they were moved with compassion for their wives and children. On a lighter note, Plutarch's dialogue on love features a debate about which is better, for men to love men or to love women. One character, Protogenes, says love between men is better because love between a husband and wife is moist and housebound, spent in the bosoms and beds of women, always chasing soft things and weakened by unmanly, unfriendly, and uninspired pleasures. In other words, love for a woman is womanly. He prefers a manlier sort of love. Now, Plutarch's father, advocating for heterosexual love, doesn't throw the insult of softness back at his pro-gay opponent, like biblical translations suggest he should. Instead, he admits there's a danger of wives dominating men through their weakness and softness. So, one debater presents any man who seeks pleasure with women as soft. The other sees only men who are dominated by women as soft. In his opinion, the opposite should be true. Neither uses the term about homosexual relationships, even though love between men is the main alternative in the debate. Chrysostom, Josephus, and Plutarch all lived alongside the writers of the New Testament, yet none of them associates malakoi with homosexuality. Two of them use the insult specifically of men in straight relationships. Sometimes soft points to a particular behavior rather than a generally womanly character. But even then, it's only sometimes homoerotic. Early Christians assumed Paul meant masturbation. As many as 5 centuries later, John the Faster, a patriarch of Constantinople, defined softness either as masturbation or what we might call a handjob. Elsewhere, soft men were said to take on a womanly appearance, shaving or plucking body hair, wearing cologne or jewelry, but in order to seduce women. After all, like attracts like. Others chalk the same soft behavior up only to idleness and wealth. It's not even sexual. Now, some slave owners did force feminized, often underage male sex slaves to shave or pluck against their will, and those slaves would be called soft. But it seems sort of odd for Paul to condemn the unwilling sex slave and not the guy who owned it. Still, the passive or receptive partner in male anal sex, what we would call the bottom, was sometimes called soft. In Greco-Roman thought, to be penetrated was in the nature of a woman, while true men were impenetrable penetrators. A guy who was penetrated, voluntarily or not, was weak, soft. Male prostitutes allowed men to penetrate them, hence the NRSV's translation. And Paul condemns heterosexual prostitution in the same chapter. If Paul was thinking of male prostitutes, he would have reasons to condemn their behavior that have nothing to do with homoeroticism. However, on rare occasions, Greco-Roman writers show an awareness that some men just like to bottom, whether with other men or with women using a strap-on dildo. In the homosexual case, by the way, only the bottom is acted badly. In the heterosexual case, both parties have. It made sense to Romans that men would want to penetrate others. It's in their nature. But not that a woman would want to penetrate others. So the heterosexual case is actually worse than the homosexual one. Many types of men and behaviors were called soft. Malakos could have a sexual meaning, but not necessarily a homosexual one. Men who masturbate, who seduce women, or who are penetrated by women are called soft. If penetration by a man were the reason for the insult, it could still refer to male prostitutes whose behavior Paul would find unethical on grounds other than gender configuration. Only sometimes did soft refer to men who were voluntarily penetrated by other men. Yet biblical translations consistently choose options that marginalize gay men, trans women, or non-binary people when there are so many other options. If malakos had too many uses to be sure of its meaning, arsenokoitai has too few. In fact, we see it for the first time in letters ascribed to Paul, and from then on basically in Christian literature. So how do later Christians understand Paul? As late as the 19th century, the Greek penitential text The Rudder understands arsenokoitai as anal sex, whether between two men or between a man and a woman. It's worth noting that the Rudder ranks anal sex scenarios according to the gravity of the sin, completely reversing certain modern Western values. Between men is bad, between a man and a woman is worse, and between a man and his wife, the worst of all. 17 centuries later, and the word had yet to take on an exclusively homosexual meaning. Still, thinking it implied anal sex arguably grew by analogy from the type of sex men were presumably having with each other. As we saw in the previous episode, Leviticus condemns anal sex between men, and Paul's word, arsenokoitai, echoes the phrasing of the second law as it appears in the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. So Paul seems to construct the neologism out of pieces from this Levitical commandment, or borrowed from someone who had. This strengthens the association with male anal sex. The resulting Greek construction is kind of vulgar, with the most literal translation being something like man-fucker. But what happens if we take the letter's original context into consideration? Corinth, the city Paul writes to, wasn't a typical Greek city. Rome had destroyed it and re-established it as a Roman colony under Julius Caesar. By Paul's day, the population was mostly Romans, not Greek, with many of them military veterans. This makes Simon Headland's observations about sex in Roman ethics deeply relevant. Today, sex might be ideally described as someone doing something with someone. In the ancient Greco-Roman context, it was more suitably described as someone doing something to someone. There was the active, penetrating masculine partner and the feminine, passive, penetrated partner. To be penetrated was considered inferior, not physically enjoyable to men, and homosexual anal penetration was treated as an aggressive act, demonstrating the superiority of the active to the passive partner. This inferiority was also ascribed to women, but in that case subordination was expected. Such a subordination was also, in varying degrees, expected of slaves, prostitutes, non-citizens, and freed slaves. The only ones supposed to be off limits for a freeborn Roman man were other freeborn Roman men and women, his wife excepted. Sex in Roman culture was hierarchical, and sex between men was ideally exploitative. Men couples of equal social status were shunned, not praised. In whatever way other cultures may have viewed sex between men, Corinthians, Paul's audience, would have understood the reference to man-fuckers as Romans would, which meant treating other men or underage boys as slaves. Paul may be particularly sensitive to this connotation since, in his view of salvation, followers of Christ are liberated, literally made free people, under God's rule, citizens of God's kingdom. To degrade another Christ follower, frequently against his will, either as a slave or like one, does not fit Paul's vision for the community. So we might expect Paul to disapprove of male homoerotic behavior in that context. But what if forced degradation is absent in the sexual relationship between two men? Would it then be legitimate in Paul's eyes? As Loveday Alexander comments, same-sex activity is not Paul's concern in this passage. It's mentioned only in passing as another example of porneia, bad sex, that is, abusive, exploitative, casual sexual activity. Concluding, for Paul, good sex is a physical act of mutual respect and self-giving love set within a faithful, committed, stable relationship recognized by the law of the land. Whether or not you agree with Paul, this sort of relationship is now possible for gay couples. Arsenokoitai does show up again in the first letter to Timothy, but unfortunately, since it just appears in another vice list, Timothy does nothing to help us understand what problem Paul had with arsenokoitai. Translators have difficulty rendering Paul's two vices. One may choose to focus on the possibility that both refer to anal sex, with some translations, like the Expanded Bible, essentially finding a reference to bottoms and tops. If they're correct, then we're right back to the problems we had with Leviticus. Not all gay couples like anal sex or practice it. The language would refer to a specific sex act, not to all the complexity of romantic relationships between men, and it doesn't refer to women at all, so why are we translating broadly enough to include lesbians? It's not clear that the pairing of the two vices is important, especially since 1 Timothy doesn't bother, so let's take them individually. In Malakos, we have a possible reference to someone who likes the bottom. With a man or a woman, it's not really clear. It wouldn't be surprising for Paul to disapprove of sex like this, but it's not really clear that he has. Paul would definitely disapprove of being unrestrained, lacking self-control, whether with regard to sex or to food, alcohol, gambling, whatever. Encouraging people to exercise self-control is a less exclusive moral and one that not only gay people need to hear, so one might choose to hear that meaning instead. Arsenokoitai probably refers to a man who has anal sex with men, which was much more common in the first century than now. Not because more people were gay, but because sex was used systemically as an instrument of domination. But one may choose to focus on the social context of that sex rather than just its gender configuration. Roman citizens forcibly penetrated their military subordinates, foreigners, slaves, and teenage boys because they were powerless to resist. And again, objecting to exploitative, coercive sex is less exclusive and fully in line with Paul's social context and with Paul's theology. It's a choice Paul's readers could make just as legitimately as choosing to hate gay people.